The storage unit was empty, and the access log showed my name next to a signature I didn't recognize. The aisle echoed when I stepped inside. The padlock I'd used for years was gone. The light flickered once and steadied, revealing bare concrete where labeled boxes had been stacked in neat columns. I stood there long enough to see the dust outlines and nothing else. He entered my life carrying my cello case. I'd been rushing out of the rehearsal hall after a late community orchestra run-through when the strap snapped on the steps. The case tipped. He caught it with one hand and took the weight without comment, steadying the neck before it hit. He didn't ask whose it was. He adjusted the latch, tested it, and handed it back like he'd handled instruments before. He said the strap would fail again. He said he could fix it properly if I wanted. He had a leather punch in his bag because he'd been mending a bike seat for a friend. He fixed the strap on the bench outside, threading it with careful fingers, tightening the rivets until the leather sat flat. He didn't charge me. He asked where I usually parked so he could walk with me. After that, he showed up where my hands were full. He carried stands. He stacked chairs. He tuned quietly at the edge when a section fell apart. He learned my schedule without asking, arriving early on nights I stayed late, leaving when I left. When a string broke mid-piece, he had a spare. He slipped it to me without stopping the count. We ate after rehearsals because it was easier than going home alone. He chose places that stayed open late. He remembered what I ordered and asked the server to pack half for later. He walked me to my car and waited until I drove off, not looking at his phone. He came to my apartment the first time to fix the strap properly. He laid out tools on a towel and worked on the kitchen table while I made tea. He asked where I stored my cases and followed me down to the basement to see the shelves. He didn't comment on the labels. He said the humidity was wrong and showed me how to prop the door so air moved through. He started coming by on Sundays to check the dehumidifier. He brought pastries and left crumbs on the counter. He wiped them up. He didn't move anything else. When I traveled for a conference, he texted photos of the gauge readings and asked if the numbers looked right. I said they did. I gave him the spare key so he wouldn't have to wait for me. It felt practical. He used it sparingly. He replaced a bulb in the stairwell and told the superintendent it was out. He fixed the rattle in the window I'd learned to ignore. We slept together without ceremony. He kept his side clear. He folded his clothes and stacked them on a chair. In the mornings, he made coffee and left a note saying which string he'd tightened and which he hadn't touched. He treated my instruments like they were alive. When I mentioned the storage unit was inconvenient, he said there was a better one closer with better airflow. He said he could help move things if I wanted. He didn't push. He waited until I asked. The first box left my hands and went into his car because the stairs were narrow and he insisted. He drove carefully. He parked where the ramp was. He stacked the boxes the way I had, labels facing out. I trusted the way he paid attention. That trust made it easy to say yes again. By the time I stood in the empty unit with the dust outlines and the wrong signature, my phone buzzed with his name asking if the strap felt right after last night's rehearsal. I didn't answer. I closed the door and listened to the lock click on a space that wasn't mine anymore. I didn't tell him about the storage unit that night. He came over after rehearsal like he usually did, carrying my stand and a bag of food balanced on top. He noticed the empty corner by the door where a box used to wait for drop-off and said nothing. He set the food down, washed his hands, and asked if I wanted the strap tightened one more notch. I said it was fine. We ate on the floor because the table was covered with sheet music. He folded the napkins into squares and set them aside. He asked how the run-through felt. He listened while I talked and didn't interrupt when I lost my place. When I stood to put the leftovers away, he followed and took the containers from my hands like it was a reflex. After, he went to the basement to check the gauge. He came back up and said the numbers looked good. He said the new unit was doing its job. He said he was glad we moved things when we did. The word we landed easily between us. He started handling more of the logistics around rehearsals. He coordinated rides for players who were late. He printed parts when someone forgot theirs. He taped a cracked bow case and returned it to its owner without saying he'd done it. When I thanked him, he shrugged and said it was easier to help than watch things fall apart. We began staying at his place sometimes because it was closer to the hall. It was sparse, clean, a mattress on a frame, no pictures. He kept my cello by the wall away from the heater and asked before touching it. In the morning, he made coffee and tuned quietly while I showered, stopping when I asked him to. He learned my habits and didn't comment on them. He noticed when I practiced longer on Sundays and brought me food without asking. He waited through runs sitting still, counting silently, nodding when I finished. When my shoulder tightened, he warmed his hands under the tap and pressed carefully, checking my face before changing pressure. I let him. The storage question came back in small ways. A text from the facility asking to confirm access hours. A voicemail about a billing update. I forwarded them to him because he'd handled the move. He replied that he'd take care of it. He always did. At rehearsal, someone asked if I downsized. They said the corner by the door looked lighter. I laughed and said yes. He was coiling cables nearby and looked up just long enough to smile. We added his name to a few things because it made sense. The rehearsal space booking. The group email. He said it would save me time. He said he'd keep me looped in. He did, at first, in short summaries that ended with everything set. He began storing his tools in my hall closet. He labeled a small box and slid it onto the shelf without asking. It didn't bother me. It made the space feel used. When I opened the closet later, he was kneeling there fixing a hinge that had been squeaking. He looked up and said it was distracting him. I gave him the storage unit code when he asked to grab rosin I'd left behind. He repeated it back to me once and didn't write it down. He said he'd go early so he wouldn't interrupt my day. That afternoon, he sent a photo of the boxes stacked tighter than before, labels facing out. He said he'd reorganized so airflow was better. He said it felt good to make it right. I replied with a thank you and put my phone down. That night, he fell asleep with his hand on my wrist, fingers resting over the place where I feel the pulse strongest. In the morning, he left a note saying he'd tightened one peg and left the rest alone. At work, the facility emailed again asking me to confirm a signature on file. I opened the message, saw my name typed beneath a line I didn't remember signing, and closed it. He texted to ask if rehearsal ran long. I said yes. I didn't mention the empty unit. I didn't ask where the boxes were now. I trusted the way he handled fragile things. That trust felt like care. He brought the new document home rolled inside a music folder. He didn't announce it. He set it down next to my stand while I was wiping rosin off the strings and waited until I finished. Then he said the storage place needed an update because of insurance. He said instruments were different from household items. He said it was better if things were clear. We sat at the table. He unrolled the page and smoothed it with both hands, careful not to crease it. It wasn't long. It wasn't framed as a change. It named him as an authorized handler and contact for the unit, listed categories of contents, reference transport and maintenance. My name was still there. It didn't look like a replacement. It looked like support. He stood while I read, leaning against the counter, giving me space. He said it didn't affect ownership. He said it just let him move things if humidity spiked or access hours changed. He said the unit manager had suggested it after the move. I signed where he pointed. After that, he stopped asking before going down there. He told me afterward instead. He said he'd rotated boxes. He said he'd moved the heavier cases away from the wall. He said one shelf had been unstable and he'd braced it. He stopped sending photos. At rehearsal, he became part of the structure. Not officially, functionally. People looked to him when something went wrong. He handed out parts. He cut off conversations that dragged. He said we'd take it again from the top and counted us in before I lifted my bow. He asked once if it was okay. I said yes. It already was. We had a night that stayed with me because nothing interrupted it. We played through a slow movement together in the living room. Just us, no stands. He followed my breathing instead of the other way around. When we finished, he didn't speak. He set the instruments down, poured water, and waited until my hands stopped shaking before touching me. We stayed like that on the floor, quiet, his chin resting against my hair. The next morning, he was already gone when I woke up. There was a note saying he'd gone early to swap a faulty lock at the unit. He said the manager thanked him for being proactive. At work, I got an automated message saying my access hours had been updated. I forwarded it to him without reading past the subject line. He replied with a thumbs up and said it was sorted. He started keeping his phone face down. When it buzzed, he glanced at it and kept talking. When I asked about rehearsal logistics, he said he'd already handled them. He said it was easier if one person coordinated. One afternoon, I went by the storage facility on my way home without telling him. The clerk at the desk smiled and asked if I was picking up or dropping off. She addressed him when she spoke, then corrected herself. She said sorry and said his name again like it was habit. When I asked for access, she asked if he was sending me. I said yes. Inside, the aisle looked different. The boxes were stacked higher. Some labels faced inward. There were cases I didn't recognize and one missing that I did. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself he knew what he was doing. That night, he came home tired and sat down heavily. I brought him water. He thanked me and said things were stable now. He said he liked that I trusted him. He said it made everything smoother. We slept close again, his hand resting over my ribs, counting my breaths without knowing he was doing it. In the morning, there was a message from the storage company confirming a consolidation request. It wasn't addressed to me. He stopped carrying things for me. Not all at once. Just enough that I noticed when my hands were full and he didn't move. At rehearsal, he stood back while I balanced the stand and the case myself. He watched ready but didn't step in unless I asked. When I did, he smiled like he'd been waiting for permission. The storage messages started coming to him only. I knew because I stopped getting them. When I mentioned it, he said he'd asked them to simplify notifications so nothing slipped through. He said they'd been over-communicating. He said it was handled. At home, he became efficient instead of attentive. He ate quickly. He checked his phone between bites. He left dishes by the sink and said he'd get them later. Sometimes later didn't come. I washed them because it was easier than waiting. He began sleeping on his side, facing away. Not far. Just not turned toward me. In the mornings, he was already up, already dressed, already elsewhere. He left notes less often. When he did, they were short. Gone early. Back late. At rehearsal, someone asked me where a particular case was stored. I answered automatically, then stopped. He answered instead, without looking at me, and said he'd take care of it. The person nodded and walked away. I told myself it was temporary. One afternoon, I needed a specific instrument from storage for a small ensemble piece. I texted him to ask if he could grab it. He replied that it wasn't accessible right now. He said it was being serviced. He said he'd let me know when it was back. I didn't remember authorizing service. When I asked which shop, he said the usual one. When I asked which technician, he said he'd check. He didn't check. That night, we ate together but didn't talk much. He scrolled while chewing. I watched his hands, the way they'd been careful with everything fragile, and tried to remember when they'd stopped being careful with me. Later, while he showered, I opened my email and searched for the storage company. There were confirmations I hadn't seen. A change of primary contact. A note about updated billing. My name appeared once under secondary. I closed the laptop when the water shut off. In bed, he reached for me out of habit and stopped halfway, like the motion had expired. He turned onto his back and stared at the ceiling. I lay there listening to the building settle around us. The next day, the orchestra administrator pulled me aside and asked if I was stepping back. She said she needed to know for scheduling. She said he'd mentioned something about streamlining roles. She said she hoped everything was okay. I said yes. At the storage facility, I tried to access the unit alone again. The clerk asked for ID and then looked at the screen longer than before. She said access permissions had changed. She said she could call him if I wanted. I said no. When I got home, my hall closet was different. The shelf with my cases was gone. In its place were his tools arranged neatly. My winter coat hung alone, pushed to the side. He came in later carrying food. He asked how my day had been. I said fine. He nodded and said good. He said the consolidation was almost complete. He said things would be simpler soon. That night, I dreamed of opening cases and finding them empty. In the morning, there was an email from the storage company confirming the consolidation had been finalized. Thanked him by name. He brought one case home that night. Not mine. It was smaller, newer, the kind used for student instruments. He set it carefully by the wall and said it had been misfiled. He said he'd return it in the morning. He didn't open it. He didn't ask me to look. I watched him wash his hands at the sink, the same way he always did after touching strings or wood. When he turned, he smiled and asked if I was hungry. I said no. We sat on the couch without touching. The case stayed where he'd put it, angled slightly toward the door like it was ready to leave. He checked his phone twice and set it face down. When I stood to go to the bedroom, he didn't follow. I woke in the night to the sound of the front door closing softly. In the morning, the case was gone. So was my bow. I noticed because the space where I kept it was empty. The felt liner smooth where it had rested for years. I checked the other cases. 2 were missing. Not all of them. Just enough to make the room feel wrong. I texted him once. Just a question mark. He replied an hour later saying he'd explain later and that everything was safe. At rehearsal, my stand was already set up when I arrived. Someone had tuned my chair height and adjusted the light. I thanked the person nearest me. They said he'd taken care of it earlier. When I asked the administrator if she'd seen my bow, she hesitated and said she thought it had been logged for transport. She said she'd assumed I knew. She said his name like it answered the question. I played with a spare. It didn't respond the same. My arm compensated without thinking, muscle memory filling in gaps I didn't want to notice. He stood at the back of the room, listening, arms crossed, nodding once when the section came together. After rehearsal, he didn't walk me out. He said he had to stay and talk to someone. He said he'd see me later. He didn't say where. I went to the storage facility again on my way home. The clerk didn't smile this time. She asked for ID and then shook her head slightly. She said the unit had been closed out. She said contents had been transferred. She said it was all finalized. I asked where. She said she wasn't authorized to share that. She said the primary contact had handled everything. She said if there was a problem, I should speak to him. At home, the hall closet was completely his now. Tools, cables, labels I didn't recognize. My winter coat was gone. On the kitchen counter was a note. Typed. Short. He said he'd moved the instruments to a safer location. He said there had been risks I didn't want to see. He said this was the best way forward. He didn't say where. That evening, I tried to play without the missing pieces. I opened cases and closed them again. My hands hovered, unsure what they were allowed to touch. The room felt quieter than it ever had, like something essential had been removed. When he came home late, I was sitting on the floor with the cases open around me. He stopped in the doorway and didn't come closer. He said we should talk tomorrow. He said tonight wasn't the right time. He stepped around me carefully, like I was another object he didn't want to damage, and went into the bedroom alone. I stayed where I was until the building noise settled and the city outside went quiet. In the morning, his side of the bed was empty. So was the shelf where I kept the last instrument I hadn't moved. On the table, my phone buzzed with an email from the storage company. It confirmed transfer of assets. It didn't list them. It listed him. The email arrived while I was at work, subject line neutral, sender automated. It confirmed that the transfer had been completed and the account closed. It listed a destination warehouse address I didn't recognize. It listed him as sole authorized contact. My name appeared once, under previous association. I didn't reply. I went to the warehouse anyway. The building sat between a tire shop and a self-storage complex, unmarked except for a number stenciled by the door. Inside, the air smelled like dust and oil. A man at a folding table asked for a name. I gave mine. He shook his head and said I wasn't on the list. He asked if I was with him. I said no. He slid a clipboard closer and said he couldn't let me pass the desk. He said the contents were already inventoried and sealed. He said everything had been handled carefully. I stood there long enough to see familiar case shapes stacked behind a wire barrier. Not all of them. Enough. At home his things were gone. Not packed. Removed. The chair where he'd folded clothes was empty. The tools were gone from the closet. The labels peeled off, leaving pale rectangles on the shelf. The kitchen drawer he'd used closed too easily now. On the table there was one envelope. Inside was a key and a short note in his handwriting. He said the warehouse staff would give me limited access during business hours if I coordinated through the number on the back. He said it was safer this way. He said emotions made people careless with valuable things. He didn't sign it. I called the number once. It rang. No answer. That evening I went to rehearsal anyway. My chair was still there. My stand. My spare instrument. The room filled around me like it always had. When we started, my hands knew what to do, but the sound wasn't right. The section adjusted without looking at me. We finished the piece. Someone nodded. We moved on. After, the administrator asked quietly if I was taking time off. She said things seemed unsettled. She said he'd mentioned a transition. I said no. At home, I opened every case I had left. I touched each one. I lined them up against the wall the way he used to, labels facing out, even though there were fewer now. The empty spaces between them stayed. Late that night, my phone buzzed. One message. He said the instruments were being placed with people who would use them properly. He said it was better than letting them sit. He said I should understand that. I didn't answer. The next morning, I took the key to the warehouse and dropped it into a mailbox on my way to work. I didn't write a note. I didn't keep a copy. At home, the cabinet hinge under the sink squeaked when I opened it. I tightened it until the door closed cleanly. The sound stopped. I packed the remaining cases into my car. It took one trip. The trunk closed with space to spare. Before I left, I stood in the doorway and looked at the room where we'd played together, where he'd followed my breathing, where he'd counted me in without lifting a bow. The floor was clear. I turned off the lights and locked the door. Outside, the street was loud. Cars passed. Someone laughed on the corner. I set the cases gently on the back seat and drove without checking the mirror. Later, in a place that wasn't home, I opened one case and rested my hand inside it. The lining was warm from the sun. I closed it again. There was nothing left to return.